You've been lied to about women who live alone. Society wants you to believe a woman without a man is broken, lonely, incomplete. They paint independence like a tragedy. But here's the truth nobody says out loud. Some women become dangerous the moment they realize they no longer need external validation to survive. Because once a woman learns how to sit alone in silence without begging for attention, something changes in her psychology forever. She becomes emotionally untouchable. A woman who lives alone starts seeing life differently. At first, the silence is loud. There's no one texting her every hour. No emotional distractions, no fake comfort. Just her thoughts staring back at her like a mirror she can't escape. And most people can't handle that stage. That's why many stay trapped in relationships that slowly destroy them mentally. But the woman who survives that silence develops a rare kind of emotional endurance. She learns how to calm herself without depending on someone else. She learns how to fight anxiety alone, pay bills alone, eat alone, heal alone, cry alone, and eventually she learns how to be happy alone. That's the part society fears because dependence is easy to control. Independence is not. A woman who constantly needs approval can be manipulated with attention, but a woman who has already faced loneliness and survived it becomes harder to emotionally trap. She no longer falls for empty words, fake affection, or temporary validation. Her standards rise because her peace became expensive. And here's something most people misunderstand. Women who live alone are not always lonely. In fact, many of them feel more peaceful alone than they ever did in relationships filled with stress, disrespect, emotional games, or betrayal. They stop romanticizing chaos. They begin protecting their energy like survival depends on it. They become selective with who enters their space because they work too hard to create emotional stability. When a woman builds a peaceful life alone, she will never again tolerate someone who brings confusion into it. That changes the way she loves. She stops chasing, stops begging, stops proving her worth. She no longer dates from desperation. She observes, she listens, she notices behavior patterns most people ignore. Why? Because solitude sharpened her awareness. And the truth is, many people feel uncomfortable around emotionally independent women. Why? Because they can't control them with fear. A woman who knows she can survive alone will walk away the second respect disappears. She doesn't stay because she's afraid of being alone. She already conquered that fear. That's real power. But there's another side nobody talks about. Living alone also forces a woman to confront herself completely. There's nowhere to hide from insecurity, trauma, or emotional wounds. The healing becomes real because the distractions disappear. And through that process, many women become wiser, calmer, and emotionally stronger than ever before. Not cold, not heartless, just aware. So the next time you see a woman living alone without a man, don't automatically assume she failed at love. Sometimes she simply stopped settling for less than peace. And once a woman discovers that peace alone feels better than pain with someone else, she becomes almost impossible to break. You know what scares people the most about a woman who lives alone? It's not her independence. It's the fact that she no longer tolerates chaos just to avoid loneliness. Most people are addicted to attention. They would rather stay in unhealthy relationships than sit alone with their own thoughts. But a woman who chooses solitude over emotional confusion has already done something most people never accomplish. She faced herself honestly, and once she tastes real peace, she becomes extremely difficult to manipulate. There's a moment that changes a woman completely. It usually happens late at night. No messages, no distractions, no emotional noise, just silence. And in that silence, she starts realizing how much energy she wasted trying to be understood, loved, chosen, or appreciated by people who never truly valued her. That realization changes her standards forever because peace becomes addictive. A woman who lives alone begins noticing something strange. Her nervous system relaxes. The constant emotional pressure disappears. No arguments draining her energy. No walking on eggshells. No pretending to be smaller just to keep someone comfortable. She finally has room to breathe mentally, and that breathing space becomes powerful. For the first time, she starts hearing her own thoughts clearly. She begins learning who she is without outside influence. What she actually likes, what she actually wants, what she will never tolerate again. That kind of self-awareness is dangerous to toxic people because toxic people survive on emotional dependency. They need confusion, guilt, insecurity, and emotional control. But a woman who built happiness in solitude becomes resistant to emotional games. She no longer mistakes attention for love. She no longer confuses chemistry with compatibility. She watches actions now. That's why many women who live alone become emotionally sharper over time. They start reading energy faster. They recognize manipulation quicker. Their intuition becomes stronger because silence trained them to observe instead of react. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Some women become more emotionally fulfilled alone than they ever were in relationships, not because they hate men, but because peace feels safer than emotional instability. Society struggles to understand this because people were conditioned to believe a woman's value depends on being chosen. But the woman who lives alone starts choosing herself first, and that completely changes her mindset. She stops begging for consistency. She becomes the consistency. She creates routines, protects her space, builds discipline, learns financial survival, learns emotional control, learns how to comfort herself instead of depending on temporary reassurance from others. And the more she grows, the less impressed she becomes by surface-level charm, because loneliness taught her something powerful. A person can sit right beside you and still make you feel emotionally alone. That's why many women eventually prefer solitude over fake connection. Not because they gave up on love, but because they finally understand that peace is more valuable than forced companionship. And the strongest part? A woman who is comfortable alone enters relationships differently. She doesn't stay out of fear. She doesn't cling from desperation. She chooses from clarity. If respect disappears, she leaves. If trust disappears, she leaves. If peace disappears, she leaves. Why? Because she already built a life she doesn't need saving from. That's the truth nobody talks about. Women who learn how to live alone often become emotionally stronger than the people who judge them for it. And once a woman realizes she can create happiness, stability, and peace on her own, the world loses one of its easiest ways to control her. The world treats independent women like a mystery. The moment a woman chooses to live alone, people start creating stories about her. She's too difficult. She hates relationships. She's lonely. Something must be wrong with her. Notice how fast society becomes uncomfortable when a woman no longer centers her entire existence around being chosen by someone else, because people understand dependent women. Independent women force people to question everything they were taught. A woman who lives alone breaks an invisible social expectation. She's supposed to constantly seek validation, attention, or emotional security from others. But when she creates peace for herself, many people don't know how to interpret it, so they judge it. But here's the truth. Most women who live alone are not running away from love. They are running away from emotional exhaustion. There's a difference. Some of these women spent years giving too much of themselves to people who drained them mentally. They tolerated disrespect. They ignored red flags. They stayed loyal to people who never protected their peace. And eventually, something inside them changed. They stopped romanticizing suffering. That transformation is powerful because it changes the way they see relationships forever. A woman who is healed in solitude no longer sees attention as proof of love. She watches consistency, effort, emotional safety, respect. And most people aren't prepared for that level of awareness. You see, society often rewards women for being emotionally available to everyone, always nurturing, always forgiving, always sacrificing. But when a woman starts protecting her energy instead of constantly giving it away, people call her cold. Why? Because boundaries offend people who benefited from having none. A woman living alone learns boundaries the hard way. She learns that not everybody deserves access to her time, emotions, body, or peace. She becomes selective because experience taught her the cost of ignoring her intuition. And that selectiveness gets misunderstood. People mistake self-respect for arrogance, silence for bitterness, independence for loneliness. But many of these women are actually the calmest they've ever been. For the first time in their lives, they are not performing for approval. They don't need constant reassurance to feel valuable. They no longer chase validation because solitude forced them to build a relationship with themselves first. That changes everything psychologically, because when a woman becomes emotionally secure alone, manipulation stops working the same way. You can't threaten her with abandonment. You can't control her with inconsistency. You can't trap her using fear of loneliness. She already survived loneliness. That's why emotionally independent women intimidate insecure people. Not because they are aggressive, but because they are free. And freedom is difficult to control. But here's the deeper truth nobody says out loud. Living alone also reveals pain. It forces a woman to confront every insecurity she once distracted herself from, every wound, every disappointment, every moment she accepted less than she deserved. Solitude becomes a mirror. And if she survives that process, she comes out stronger than before, more aware, more disciplined, more emotionally intelligent, not perfect, just healed enough to stop betraying herself for temporary affection. So when society misunderstands women who live alone, it says more about society than it does about those women. Because the truth is, a woman who can create peace without depending on anyone else has already achieved something rare. She learned how to belong to herself before belonging to anybody else. A strong woman living alone terrifies certain people for one reason. She cannot be controlled by fear anymore. That's the real truth nobody wants to admit. A woman who depends emotionally, financially, or mentally on others is easier to manipulate. Promise her attention, and she stays. Threaten abandonment, and she tolerates disrespect. Give her temporary affection, and she ignores red flags. But the woman who learned how to survive alone becomes different. She becomes harder to break. And that changes the entire power dynamic. C, living alone forces a woman into a psychological transformation most people never experience. There's no one constantly validating her. No one rescuing her during emotional storms. No one carrying her responsibilities. At some point, she realizes that if her life is going to improve, she has to become her own source of stability. That realization creates strength most people can't fake, because strength built in silence always looks different. A woman living alone learns how to solve problems without panic. She learns financial discipline, emotional control, mental resilience. She learns how to survive difficult nights without needing someone to save her emotionally. And every time she overcomes something alone, her confidence becomes more real, Not loud confidence, kit confidence, the dangerous kind, the kind that doesn't need approval to exist. And once a woman reaches that level mentally, manipulation starts failing. Why? Because fear no longer controls her decisions. She's not afraid of eating alone, sleeping alone, building alone, healing alone. So suddenly, toxic behavior loses power over her. Guilt stops working. Mind games stop working. Emotional inconsistency stops working. Because she already understands something many people never learn. Being alone is painful sometimes, but staying in a draining relationship is worse. That awareness changes her standards forever. She no longer tolerates confusion just because someone is attractive. She no longer stays loyal to potential while being disrespected in reality. She watches actions closely because solitude trained her to observe patterns instead of getting emotionally addicted to words. And this is where many people misunderstand strong women. They think independence means arrogance. It doesn't. Most strong women were not born emotionally guarded. Life made them that way. Disappointment trained them. Betrayal sharpened them. Loneliness matured them. They became strong because weakness became too expensive. That's why many women living alone appear calmer than everyone around them. They are no longer desperate for validation. They are no longer chasing attention to feel valuable. They built a relationship with themselves first. And once a woman respects herself deeply, she becomes extremely difficult to emotionally manipulate because now she chooses relationships from desire, not desperation. That's real power. But there's another layer people rarely talk about. A woman who lives alone often becomes highly self-aware. Silence gives her time to analyze people, patterns, intentions, and energy. She becomes harder to deceive because solitude sharpened her intuition. She notices inconsistency faster. She feels dishonesty quicker. She listens beyond words. And that awareness makes weak people uncomfortable because people who rely on manipulation need access to insecurity. But a healed woman alone slowly removes those insecurities one by one. So no, the strongest women are not always the loudest. Sometimes the strongest woman is the one sitting quietly in her apartment at midnight, rebuilding her life alone, healing in silence, learning discipline, protecting her peace, and refusing to lower her standards just because the world fears women who no longer need permission to feel whole. That woman becomes unstoppable because once a woman realizes she can survive alone, the fear that once controlled her disappears forever. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, don't ignore it. Like this video, subscribe to YouTube, and join a community that understands the silent strength, emotional intelligence, and hidden power most people never see. Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones healing quietly while the world misunderstands them.